Recording. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Aware Athlete Show. I'm your host, Scott Forrester, and today we're very pleased to have with us as our guest, Ethan Gallogly. And Ethan has written a very fascinating, page-turning, and important book called The Trail. It is a novel, so it's fiction, but based on a lot of life experience. So Ethan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And you're absolutely right about the book. It's a work of fiction, but I'd say 90% of what's in that book, maybe 85%, is based on my own experiences as a hiker, kind of, woven together into a good story to keep the reader interested while sharing what I want to share there.
Yeah, so can you give us briefly a little bit of your background? What is the very first thing that got you interested in backpacking? And then where have you backpacked?
Oh, sure. So actually, I've been camping since I was young. My folks used to love, not love, but we would go car camping once a summer or so, and I loved it. I think I just looked forward to that like crazy, and I used to love those car camps. And then when I was 13, I took a bicycle tour through Vermont, New Hampshire. I grew up on the East Coast, and we were in pup tents every day, and we did 50, 60 miles through the hills a day, and I just loved that. I really enjoyed that, but I'd never done much hiking. And in fact, if as a kid you had asked me, would you ever be a hiker? I probably would have said no, because, I didn't like long walks. Long walks were things like having to carry my book bag to school, right? I was kind of opposed to that as a kid. And then, after college, I moved out to California, and my friend Denise came and visited me. She, a number of East Coast friends wanted to see California, but Denise and I took a trip to Yosemite National Park. I had never been, and I was blown away. I mean, I can't tell you the feeling, the sense of awe looking at, those walls of granite, those peaks, the waterfalls at Half Dome. I was just blown away. And, we took a hike, and this is a funny story. We wanted to take a day hike somewhere, just something easy, and then get dinner. And we looked at the map, and the map described different things. And there was Upper Yosemite Falls, and it said 3 miles. And I'm like, okay, 3 miles. That's a perfect relaxed hike. We took a couple of apples and a bottle of water. It was, about 11 o'clock, and we head off for Upper Yosemite Falls. Have you ever done that hike? I don't know if you've hiked Yosemite.
Well, no, actually, I haven't done that very much because I have a dog that I love so much, and he can't hike in the national park. So I've avoided him for a number of years.
Yeah, that's a problem with the national parks is, you can't take a pet into the wilderness there. So
yeah, he's hiked through the desert and been through some tough stuff, but
yeah,
you can't go there.
If any of the listeners are pet owners, the secret is the national forests. They let you bring in pets, but not the national parks. I think all the national forests do. I've never been able to keep a dog because I do too much traveling. It'd be irresponsible. But, as I was saying, the Upper Yosemite Falls is a 3,000 foot climb. And in those days, I had no idea what 3,000 feet meant. To me, that's just a short walk, if you lay it down flat, but vertically, that's huge. And so we didn't make it. We were in the sun. We got up about a quarter of the way. We were out of water. We'd eaten our apples. We were exhausted. In fact, we had to beg for water from people on the trail, and they were so nice. They shared their water, and we got ourselves back down. We had a big dinner, but despite that experience, I kept looking at Half Dome, and I kept thinking, I want to climb that. I want to go out and carry a backpack and experience it. And so the next year, I got a very old book, Backpacking One Step at a Time. Some of your listeners may know it. It's a classic. I read it cover to cover. I went to our REI in Sacramento and I fitted up. I take that back. I went to the REI in Berkeley, actually, and I fitted up for a pack, one of these old external frame packs, and I got a tent, a very heavy tent. And I packed up. And the next year, a friend of mine and I, we went in on what we planned to be a 10-day backpack, my first trip ever, a 10-day trip,
Wow.
including a climb a half dome. And, we got in there, we climbed Half Dome, and, it was just a wonderful experience, almost. Yeah. I was a total novice. That frame pack I overpacked food. I had the wrong gear. I mean, I'm not joking. It weighed 75 pounds going in. And, I was a young 20 something. I carried it, but it was so overweight. It's ridiculous. And when I look back on it, I'm amazed that I didn't quit on the first mile, because it was just way too heavy. But I learned a lot about backpacking that first trip, and I really loved it. I fell in love with it. And after that, I think, I must have taken every free weekend I had and gotten myself into the Sierra, up to Lake Tahoe, Desolation Wilderness. I became eventually a leader in the local Sierra Club chapter and took other people backpacking. I just got into it in a huge way. And the Sierra has kind of been my playground since. So, I just loved it.
So if anyone listening doesn't know, the John Muir Trail is rather world famous. And it is said to, although I haven't hiked that one, it is said to have some of the most beautiful scenery in the entire world. So
I'd have to agree. Now there's certainly some really amazing spots, in different parts of Europe and Norway and, everywhere else. I think you can find beautiful scenery in many places. But the thing about the Muir Trail is you're isolated. You're away from roads. You're in a true wilderness experience. And so those vistas, those scenes, those mountains, the background behind me here is a photo I took off the Muir Trail. This is in the Evolution Basin. Those sights are so moving and profound, and to see them up close and personal, and not, from the window of a car with your kids saying, "Are we there yet? What are we going to eat?" But where you're really out and hiking in nature, that is something. And yes, the scenery, the vistas, they're amazing. I mean, just it's incredible. You were asking me about hiking, and for the book in 2016, I decided to through hike the Muir Trail. I'd never through hiked a long distance trail. The longest I had been out was about 12 days. And, I had done something akin to the High Sierra Trail, where I went across the Great Divide from the west side to the east side of the Sierra. And I think I took 12 days to do that. And that was a great hike. I really liked it. But I've never done something on the scale of the Muir Trail. The Muir Trail is about 211 miles. It's really about 220, because it ends at the top of Mount Whitney, the tallest peak in the lower 48, in the contiguous United States is how they say it. And I'd never done something on the order of, even 100 miles, but, let alone 220, where you're out for almost a month. So it was a very different trip. But I was turning 50, and I said, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this now. And then I started looking for people who wanted to go with me, and, who has a month off. And if you have a month off, most people are going to do something like Europe or something with the family, or they're going to break it up. A lot of people can't get a straight month off in a row. The boss will be like, yeah, take the year off. It's hard to do. But my friend Joey, who is a backpacker, he wanted to do it, but he could only do 2 weeks. And my wife, who has done some backpacking, this was a big trip for her. She agreed to join me for 2 weeks. And so we set up an exchange where
Oh, yeah.
I started with Joey and, in Yosemite, and we went in and then we hiked to LeConte Canyon, which is just about halfway on the Muir Trail. It's right by the LeConte Ranger Station is where Bishop Pass goes out. And my wife came in on horseback with a resupply bucket. It would have been too much to make her walk over Bishop Pass. She and a friend from work named Tram came in on horseback, with the Rainbow Pack outfitters out there in Bishop, very nice folks. And, Joey rode back out on the horses, and my wife and I continued to Whitney. So, I exchanged partners halfway through, but I did, the entire trip on foot. And I never exited the wilderness that trip. The closest I came to exiting was at Red's Meadow, where it touches a road in Devil's Postpile. So I touched a road there. Everybody does. But that was as much as I left the wilderness. The rest was completely out in the wilderness, and it was fantastic. So you talk
it's an
about
experience hardly anybody has, I'm in the Wind River Range in Wyoming. It used to be like that. It's getting a little bit more crowded now, but you could go a couple of days without seeing another soul.
Well, not on the Muir Trail. The Muir Trail has actually become very popular. I think if you had done it, back in the day, maybe you would have done it back when there were 500 or 600 people and all spread out. You probably would have only encountered folks once in a while. Now it's quite the opposite. Now Yosemite has to limit the permits. There's a lottery. In fact, as we talk, people are online, discussing the lottery, because it's about 6 months in advance that you get your permits for summer. And it's very frustrating to a lot of people. They get turned down, but there's a good reason for the lottery, and that is they want to preserve that wilderness feel. So in fact, I think from Yosemite, they limit it to about 2,000 people a year who can hike it. And it sounds like a big number, but the demand is far higher. And you do see the people. In fact, you start to leapfrog. So in my book, I introduce some characters, and they meet them again and again on trail. And that's very much a real experience. You meet kind of a bubble of folks, and you leapfrog, but you start running into the same people again and again, which is kind of interesting. And you can get as much solitude as you want, or almost as much community. Some people form little trail families and hike together. Some people stay isolated. Some do a mixture. And another thing I've discovered on the Muir Trail, it's quite interesting, is if you want solitude, you just go off trail, even a mile. You 500 feet sometimes. You just, here's a side lake. You walk to that lake, you're going to be alone. So if you want that true solitude experience, you just go off trail a bit. Now, I have done what's called the Theodore Solomon's Trail. It's an unofficial trail. It parallels the JMT up the west side. It's a very rough trail. I would not recommend it to anyone who's a beginner. You really need to know route finding and set up your supplies. It's not documented in the way that the Muir Trail is. But there's a Facebook group for it. And if that's your thing, it's quite interesting, because on that trail, I think, there are stretches where I went 5-6 days without seeing a soul. And, where I was the only one there. And that, where you're bushwhacking and route finding, that's really a true wilderness experience, like the old explorers. And that was very interesting and very, very different from the Muir Trail. But no, it's not quite as isolated as you'd think, but you can find quite a bit of solitude in the mountains, as much as you want, as much as you desire.
Yeah, you can do that. It's the same way with the PCT. If you hike the PCT during hiking season, occasionally you'll go most of the day without seeing somebody, and then somebody will come up from a parking lot and be a day hiker, but usually very, very frequently you can be passed by through hikers all throughout the day. It's not like you're never alone. You can be alone if you want to, just like you said. And even in the Wind Rivers, the campgrounds are different now. They're more crowded. There's smaller spaces where you can, have somebody pick you up at the campground. All the spaces are smaller, lots more restrictions, lots more people you meet on the trail, less likely to go those days without seeing people. So the quotas are unfortunate sometimes, but what are you going to do?
Yeah, they're walking a very tough balance, right? They want people to experience the wilderness. It's not like they're trying to be gatekeepers and keep people out, but if you get too many folks out there, they're very sensitive areas, right? People are doing their business in the woods, people are setting up tents, and all that impacts the environment. And in order to give everybody who's out there a real wilderness experience and protect the beauty of it, you have to do some control, some limitation, and some rules. There are definitely practices that the rangers go through about camping a certain distance from water and so forth, that are very important for protection of the wilderness. So and not leaving trash, not leaving toilet paper, that's a huge thing. And you want to leave it as pristine and as beautiful as you found it for the next person.
Exactly. Yeah, you do. You want to do your best with that. So we've talked about how beautiful the scenery is in the Sierra and other places, but when I go outside here, I live in Oregon, and I live in a smaller town, and I go outside, and there are still dirt roads around here, and unfortunately, they're tearing down a lot of the trees, right around the house where they're building more houses. But we don't have to go far at all before you're out in the forest. And I open my eyes every day. The sun comes in, the trees are out there, the beautiful mountain views we have here. So right at your house, nature comes right into your soul whenever you look for it. It's a different experience out there in the wilderness, even more immersive, but it's all around us. And I'm really fortunate to live where I live, because this is a picture here behind me on the PCT, but and it won't look quite that way around my house, but I get to enjoy some of that. I see snow-covered mountains all the time, even looking out my window. So it's a wonderful thing. So
oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I really understand where you're coming from there. Where I grew up, my folks had purchased a home that was, it was wooded around the house. It was in a rural neighborhood, but it was wooded on the East Coast. And I used to love looking out at the trees. Sometimes a deer would show up, or a squirrel or something. And walking to school, I had to go across through the woods, and I loved that. And when I moved out to California, of course, the Sierras, it's incredible. But now I'm in Southern California. My job has taken me to a city, and I miss that. I miss that in a huge, huge way. And when I retire, I'm moving back north. I'm moving back to somewhere a little more natural. It's like what Muir said, the mountains are calling. I want to be like you and wake up and look out the window and see green, and see, not be listening to car sounds, but be listening to the sounds of nature. And that's so important in our lives, to touch nature in that way. And I think it grounds us and it relaxes us, And it just does something that, you know, we get cut off from in the city. And I think, you know, in my book, that's part of the message of my book. That's part of the underlying theme is sometimes we need to go to nature, right? We need to step out of our busy lives and take time out for recreation. And, you know, it's an interesting word, recreation, because if you break it up, it becomes recreation. And I like to say recreation is recreation. It's recreating ourselves. It's regrounding ourselves. It's giving us time to breathe and reflect and really just say, hey, who am I? Where am I going? What's my greater connection to life, right? To the wider universe, rather than just, you know, what do I have to do today? What's on my calendar? Which I think a lot of us get lost in. So one of the messages, I think you've read the book, one of the strong themes is the importance of nature and the importance of taking time out. I think that's a huge thing. And being able to find a home in nature, I mean, I envy you. That's fantastic. Just being able to wake up to that. From my childhood, I remember that, and I'm longing for that. And I think as humans, we all have that yearning in our soul for, you know, that connection to the natural world that we all came from.
Yeah, I think in New York City, I visited, haven't ever lived there, but they have Central Park, and they have to have that, you know, so people can, so they can live. And then in Europe, they have the term forest bathing. Yep. And like I say, a lot of people, maybe they just go for a walk in the park at noon, and just being out there quiets your mind a little bit. Now, some people say,
isn't it amazing the designers of New York? And I was born in New York. So I'm familiar with the city. Isn't it amazing that the designers recognized that need and carved out Central Park? Because today developers would be all over that, right? You know, it'd be a golf course there'd be high rises there. You know, I think people have lost touch with that need, but back when they designed New York, they really were aware enough to leave that huge swath of wilderness, and just how important it is to New Yorkers. You know, how nice to be able to leave your building and be in nature and be able to take a jog or a walk in a semi-wilderness surrounding like that. You know, not everyone can get up here to the Sierra, but just touching a place like Central Park may be enough to break out of that craziness of the unnatural world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and the more time you can spend in nature, if you can spend more than an hour, if you can spend more than a weekend, if you can spend enough time that you kind of get into a routine of being there, that's even better. I envy the fact that you are planning a PCT through hike. I hope to do it all, but I'll do it in sections of a few hundred miles at a time.
Well, I've got to retire first. You know, the PCT is a big animal. That's, you know, if people don't know, that's a trail that was developed later, you know, I think in the 70s. You know, they connected up a bunch of different trails, and it goes from the Mexican border into Canada. So you're hiking essentially the full length, you know, or top to bottom length of the United States. And I think it's 2,600 and something miles. I mean, it's a crazy amount of distance. And to do that, you know, with the seasons and the snow and everything, you can't just take that stroll in the park. You've got to be doing, I think, an average of 15 to 17 miles a day, which is no easy thing with the backpack. I mean, when I did the Muir Trail, I was doing an average of eight miles a day. And, you know, so you've got the speed, you've got the weather coming at you, you hit the Sierra and the snow, and, you know, every day you're walking. So that's a big thing. And it takes 5 or 6 months. So after I retire, that's when I'm looking at doing my PCT attempt, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm also nervous about it. I'd be lying if I said I thought it was going to be a cakewalk or, the greatest thing. I think having to do that kind of miles day in, day out, and being separated from your loved ones out there, that takes a toll mentally and physically. But I'm looking forward to it. I'm a little nervous about it, but it's something I have wanted to do for many, many years, but just, you can't get that kind of time unless, 6 months, unless you're either in your 20s, you've just graduated college. A lot of those hikers are, they're early in their career, or you're retired. And, that's part of the experience on trail is on these long trails. Most of the people you see are either, 20 somethings or, they're late 50s, early 60s.
Or 70s.
Yes. And, I didn't mean to leave that out.
Yeah.
When I did a section of the PCT, I was doing Oregon. I was passed by someone, I think he was 73, 74, and that guy was moving. I mean,
Yep.
he was doing 20-mile a days, and he just blew, we talked a little, but then he just blew by me. I could not keep up with this guy. And, it's amazing. But yes, in fact, wasn't it somebody in his late 80s who just completed the Appalachian Trail? So,
83, I think.
Yeah, you can't say that age is a limit. I think anyone who wants to do this, if you start out slow, you train, and your book is very much about that. You prepare. I think anyone who has, the physical ability can do this. I mean, I'm not in the greatest shape, and yet, I'm out there hiking these things, and I think anybody
you will be by the time you've walked 1,800 miles.
Oh yeah. I've seen, when I was in Oregon, some of the people I was hiking with, or I caught up to, who were PCTers. One woman showed me her photographs from the beginning, from Mexico, and she was huge. And here she was, this little thing in amazing shape. I mean, amazing shape. And who knew, right? When she started, she was as big as me, So I was like, wow, yeah, these long distance hikes are one of the best diet plans you can imagine. When I did the JMT, I lost 25 pounds,
Oh, yeah.
in a month, and it was a healthy diet. I mean, I was in great shape at the end of that.
Yeah, we're built to move, and in our modern life, we never moved like that. I did work at the post office as a letter carrier for 22 years. So at that point, I could walk 24 hours in a day, but I don't have that now.
No.
Anyway,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, I make it a point to walk a little every day. And I think it's really, really important. I think we neglect that sometimes, but you're right. Our bodies are built for walking, and it's important to walk. And I think I'd read a study somewhere that, just walking a mile or two every day is life extending, that you're going to live an average of, I don't know, 5 or 10 years longer, just by doing a mile or two a day. So,
that's even something moderate. Exercise affects every cell in your body. I'm actually lighter than I've been in my adult life. Of course, I'm not doing the same work. When I was doing construction work, I figured I had to be heavier than what I was lifting all day. But I mean, you just do bulk up a little bit when you're lifting boards and walls all day and things like that. But yeah, you do lose a lot of weight. So you mentioned a 75-pound backpack. Well, when my kids first said, hey, we got to go camping, we got to go backpacking. Well, we went backpacking in 0-degree weather. And so I had worked outside all my life. I knew you don't mess with that. You go prepared. But what I had was heavy work clothes, the big duck insulated coveralls and all, and it works. and I had a 5 or 6 pound backpack and an 11-pound tent, and and pretty soon I had 75 pounds. And then I was taking things I didn't need, but I didn't know that. I had to take a camp chair, and I think I took an axe, because it might have to have firewood.
Yeah. You
Stuff
learn
like
from
that.
doing. You really learn from doing.
You learn from doing. Yeah. So eventually, after the kids were gone, and I began to get out in the wilderness, the real wilderness, I had a completely different mindset about all that. And I approached it as more as an engineer than somebody who had worked outside all their life, where you engineer everything. And some people don't weigh everything, but I got to weighing quite a bit and seeing. And anyway, so there's a different mindset on the PCT. And nowadays, there's a few people that can get their base weight down to 5 or 7 pounds. Mine was a little bit more because I feel that it's so important to have my phone charged. You can get so much navigation, pictures. When you do have cell phone coverage, you can talk to your wife, which makes her very delighted that you're still alive. And or you could carry another electronic device to do that.
No, it's very interesting. I know exactly what you're talking about base weight. And again, for people who don't hike, the base weight is a measure of the weight of your backpack and your gear without your food or water. It's just, what are the essentials that you're bringing with you? And a lot of ultralighters will try to get that base weight, all your equipment, down to maybe 10 or 15 pounds. Some amazing folks who are really skimping it. And I question the safety sometimes, because if you get into a snowstorm or some issue, you may not have enough equipment. But some folks swear by and get it down to 5 pounds, which I find amazing. And you're right about the electronics. I weigh all my stuff now. I didn't before, but I do now. And ever since long distance hiking, I've learned, you got to weigh it all. You've got to get the lightest stuff you can get, because you got to carry it up and down all those mountains and all those days. It affects you. And I realized I'm carrying 2 pounds of electronics. 2 pounds, which doesn't sound like much, but it's, when you're thinking you want to keep your base weight under 15 or under, I've been able to get mine to 19 with the electronics. So I'm not an ultra lighter, but I try. But 2 pounds of electronics is a lot. Now, I've got a camera in there. So the camera is 1 pound, and I've got a cell phone, and that's almost half a pound, and then I've got an inReach, the little satellite device. And like you say, I've got a brick, I've got one of those, charging bricks. But there was a point last year where I was looking at all that, and I was thinking, back in the 80s, when I was first backpacking, there were no electronics. I might have a camera, but I did not have any of this stuff. I didn't need it, quote unquote need. I was doing just fine without it. And in fact, some of it I feel keeps me connected. Sometimes I feel it's better not to have that stuff, that there's something, when you can call somebody on that inReach, even though, if there's an emergency, that's really important. But there was something about not being able to contact anyone that really put you in the wilderness and really made you aware of your surroundings in a way that carrying those electronics does not. So it's kind of interesting. I had an experience, and this was in Oregon on the PCT, where I had my cell phone and I had an audiobook. And I started listening to the audiobook on trail, something like when I biked to work, I would listen to an audiobook, or when I was stuck in traffic, and I thought, oh, how nice, listen to a book. So I listened to this book for 3 days, and afterwards, those 3 days of trail were a blank. I could remember the book. I could remember all the details in the book, but I couldn't remember where I had been. And that was very surprising because, for the JMT, where I didn't have any music or audiobooks, I can still remember every single day of trail, every single site. I mean, maybe not in perfect memory, but when you're walking and you're aware of your surroundings, it leaves a very deep impression in you. But those 3 days where I was listening to the book are a blank. I don't remember that section of trail. And so, it's another thing about the electronics. I think when you're out there, it's a good thing to turn them off, to disconnect, to be reflective, and really just present in the moment and in your surroundings. So it was an experience for me, and it was a lesson. It was, something where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do this again. I liked being able to listen to the book, but I think I like even more being immersed in the world around me. And I think it's more healing. It's part of the experience, is being completely present in the moment. I think you asked earlier how I came to write the book, but it was very much that experience where, after hiking the full length of the John Muir Trail, I'd spent 28 days on trail. I got back to Los Angeles, but I couldn't get the trail out of my mind. And I think a lot of hikers will tell you this, because you're so present, you're so focused, every day of that hike kept replaying itself in my head. My wife and I, for example, went to get a massage not long after. You can imagine our legs. And, I'm being massaged, and in my head, it's like a movie. I'm playing every day on trail, and it just kept happening. And I really wanted to share that. I wanted to share my experience with people. And, I'd never thought of doing a book, but I teach college, and I spoke about it to some of my colleagues, and they were like, oh, why don't you give a talk? And I thought, okay, that's great. I'll give a talk about my hike. I'll share why I love backpacking so much. I'll share what the experience is. We'll get a couple of the young people out there to hear about it. This is great. So I started preparing for this talk, and one thing led to another. And unfortunately, we got a famous speaker at the college. They needed that time slot, and I got canceled, so I didn't get to give the talk. But, it's one of the most fortuitous cancellations I've ever had, because, I had done all this research. I had researched the history. I had just started reading about it, and I realized, there's this incredible history of the Muir Trail. It's one of the oldest trails in America. And, it's just amazing that we have this trail across the rooftop of the Sierra, that people planned this and got funding for it. And, the Sierra Club was involved. In fact, it was the early Sierra Club. And, it's really amazing that this exists at all. And so I really got into the history, and I realized, I had known none of this. When I'd hiked the trail, I went through places like Evolution Valley behind me, or McClure Meadow, or whatever. And I didn't know who McClure was. It was just a name, it was just this nice name of a place in the wilderness. But of course, there was a McClure, and he was very important. He was the surveyor, the chief engineer, who rode up and down and, made sure the route was feasible. So, I learned about who are all these people, who were the explorers, what did John Muir have to do with it? And I realized there's a lot more here than just a lecture. I thought, there's a book here. other people like me who may have hiked the trail or maybe thinking about the trail or who may be interested in the Sierra would probably benefit from knowing this history. But I couldn't write a history book because it would be too esoteric, right? A history of the development of the John Muir Trail, a very scholarly book. I think there'd be 6 people who would buy and
Yeah.
read that book. And I know them. I know those 6. I know exactly who they are. And, we're friends now. We hang out and talk about history. But, it wouldn't get a very big audience. And I really wanted to reach, the people who are hiking the trail and people who are just kind of armchair explorers and interested in this sort of thing. And, I realized, my own story is interesting, but what people really like is a novel. They really like a good story. And I said, if I put this in novel form, if I write a good story and I show, through the story, why is it I like backpacking? So I hit upon having the protagonist be a guy who doesn't want to go backpacking and doesn't like it. And, he's got all the same concerns that someone who's never hiked would have, right? Oh, it's going to be tiring. And, why can't we just see it from the car window? And, why do we have to walk? And I don't want to carry a pack. And, how are we going to shower? And, there are going to be bugs and, everything else that, he goes through all that stuff. But, he eventually comes to love it. And I think by doing that, I take the reader through that experience of what is it like to backpack and why would anyone do this? Why would anyone, want to shower in a river with cold water? Why would anyone want to brave the bears and the bugs? But, I show that in the book. And I also, there's an older character. We were talking about this earlier, the protagonist, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but he has
Okay, we won't do
cancer.
that.
He's
It is a
dying.
fantastic book, by the way. It's
Oh,
called The Trail, and I'm going to put a picture of it up. Fantastic cover artwork. When we get this up, we'll put a picture of the book up too.
all right. And let me come back to the cover. There's a story there too. Yeah, so the older guy in the book, Sid, he's dying of cancer. And the younger guy, Gil, he learns that right off. And of course, there's a question, is Sid going to make it? And I'm not going to say anything about that. But it's a question as to whether, his hiking partner, Sid, is going to make it. But, while they're hiking, Sid shares the history of the trail. He shares those details that I had discovered for that lecture. So, it's just in there like campfire stories where you come away knowing both what the experience is like, what is it like day by day to hike the trail, and a little bit about the history and the background. And I think, people, it's been very well reviewed. In fact, Chris Townsend in the UK, we just got the news. He listed it in his top 15 favorite outdoors and nature books of 2021. So I was thrilled. I mean, that's wonderful. If you know
So
him,
I have to interrupt you to say that you took on a very difficult task there, because by the time, really, because you have integrated a lot of things into that book, so that when you get done reading the book, you'll have some idea of the history of the trail. And you will also have a greater appreciation for the difficulties of the trail. And because your character Sid, there was a question whether he would make it. Well, that is actually a question that we all have when we start out on something like that. So you integrated that in there, and then you integrated some emotional aspects, some non-esoteric physical experiences, and you integrated something. Of course, you're trying to give somebody the experience of what it is to be out in nature, and a lot of people don't know, but almost everybody who's out doing something 200, 300, 400 miles, 2,000 miles, they're asking questions. And so when you get into the trail culture, you're not going to find a lot of people that are just out there just ho hum, I'm just hiking along. they actually have some deep experiences that are getting into some deep questions in their life that they're asking. So when you brought that into the narrative, if you've hiked a lot, you know that that's actually out there. That's not contrived. It's part of the trail story, you know, what it means deeply to each individual. So you wove all of that together into a novel. Is kind of a difficult thing to do. You know, you don't want to get too much history in because it takes away from the storytelling. But you wove it all in there very, very skillfully. So I'm going to say, you guys, if you're interested in backpacking, in the Muir Trail, in the beauty of nature, in transformative experience, pick up the book. You really have put a lot into it, and it's kind of an amazing job of how you wove all that together. And I'm sure it changed your perception of the difficulty of being an artist writer.
Thank you. That's beautiful. And I'm you know, I know you've read the book, and I'm very glad, you know, you had that experience, because that's exactly, you know, those are exactly the things I'm trying to share with people in the book. And, you know, as I said, Chris Townsend, you know, he's an editor at The Great Outdoors, the biggest, you know, outdoor magazine in the UK, had listed it in his top 15, and it's no, you know, that's huge. So I think it is succeeding in that way, and people are starting to read it and realize this is more than just a hiking novel, right? Like you're alluding to, when you're out in nature, you're really thinking about life. You're really thinking about your place in the universe. You can't help but stand in a place like the scene behind me and think, you know, my God, there, you know, in the book, I describe it as like standing in God's workshop. You really feel connected to everything and the greater world around you. And you start asking those big questions. And of course, in the book, Sid has, you know, there's a question of his mortality. So meaning of life comes up very naturally in the book, and how best to live our lives. You know, that's what the younger guy is struggling with, is what should he be doing with his life? And the two of them begins, you know, albeit they start out very much on different, you know, they start out here and here missing each other, but eventually they start communicating, and very much from the heart. And that's been my experience when you're out in nature. Is it's different from the office. You know, when you're in the office, everyone has their shields up, everyone has their defense, right? You're dressed up nicely, you're trying to present your professional appearance, and if somebody says, how are you feeling, you're going to say, good, how about you, right? No, you could be going through the craziest stuff emotionally, but in the office, you're like, I'm good. How are you? Oh, you're good. Yeah, everybody's good. But out in nature, where you're relaxed and, you know, you're meeting these folks, the shields are down. People, most people, not everyone, but most people who are out there are very open to that human experience. And you have conversations with people out in nature that are very deep, very profound, and I think they're what we would have if we lived in tribes, if we were, you know, more of a communal society where people felt they didn't have to be so professional and defensive, but rather we had more community. We were more supportive of each other. And, you know, people on the PCT talk about this quite a bit, that trail culture really changes them. And you know, you read these people's memoirs of hiking the PCT, and one of the themes, one of the most central themes, and you'll find this in almost every hiking memoir, is this desire that, you know, outside of the hiking trail, this desire that why can't the world be more like this? You know, they feel so connected to everyone in a human way on trail. And you know this because you've hiked. But if you've never hiked, if you go out there for a longer trip and you start meeting and talking with people, you'll realize there's an openness, there's a humanity, there's a connection that people have with each other on trail that is different from most, I can't say all, I haven't experienced everything, but from most things you'll find in our modern society, quote unquote, right? You know, you know what I'm saying, right? It's profound.
Yeah, it is. If you go out during a work day and you eat your lunch under a tree, that makes you feel better, and then you go right back to work. But if you spend enough time out in nature where you don't go right back to that environment, you spend a week, you spend 2 weeks, spend 3 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever. Pretty soon, that uninterrupted time in nature, I think there's a silent message there. It starts to creep in a little bit, and we're not really human sometimes when we sit in an office. A lot of time, we're exercising some of what it is to be human. You know, we're doing a lot of thinking or working, but sometimes being a human is putting your feet on the ground and moving.
Yes.
In fact, yes. Humans have, we know back, the way they populated the planet was by migrating and feet on the ground. And humans are actually the top endurance athlete in the entire world. You know the story of persistence hunting. People can outrun an antelope on a hot day. You're familiar with that?
No, go ahead.
That was actually, it was a theory that Joe Lieberman, I think, talked about in Harvard. Anyway, it was hard to prove because you could take top runners and they would go out and they can't run down an antelope in Wyoming. But then somebody, if I get all this correctly, spent some time with the Kalahari Bushmen, and they can do it. Anyway, Joe Lieberman was theorizing that is one of not only our main ecological advantages, but actually had a big influence on our evolution as humans, the ability to do these things. So it's the contact foot on the ground. So when you do that, you're actually expressing a deep human attribute, that ability to travel over the ground like that for long distances, day after day. And we did a lot of migrating before there were horses to carry the load and things like that. Anyway, so you're becoming more human when you put your feet on the ground day after day. And you're becoming, you're becoming like an animal. You're living out there like they do, drinking out of the same streams and so on. But you get a greater respect for the animals too, because you don't have the unique survival advantages that they do. Humans have the ability to adapt faster through many different ways, through the sharing of knowledge and so on.
I've read a little of your book, and there was a point, I think, where you describe a night that you spent on a mountain in freezing climate, and you were shivering and you were looking at, I think it was a spider that was up there and just doing its spider thing, but you were freezing and realizing that you needed this sleeping bag and so forth to be able to survive in that atmosphere, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it was getting too late in the season. I needed to get out of there. But that's what I learned later, is that certain insects, they have a sort of a antifreeze system. They secrete a certain chemical, and it keeps the fluids that are in them from freezing, and they can go through things that we can't.
Wouldn't it be cool if we could do that? Yeah.
What's that?
Wouldn't it be cool if we could do that?
Yeah. But then we'd just be an insect.
Well, but you say we're living like the animals in a way, but in a way we're not, right? Because
and that's the point. You have more respect for what they can do too, and for the world around you then out there.
Yes, there's a point in the book where they see a bear, and Gil starts thinking about that, and he realizes that the bear experiences nature so much more directly than he ever can, and if you think about it, you've got this backpack. It's made of plastic, right? You've got a plastic tent and, some high tech sleeping bag and all this. And we've got all this modern equipment to get the weight down that we're relying on out there. And you can get by without it. If you read Muir, Muir certainly did. Muir would not carry a sleeping bag. He got out in the wilderness, found pine needles and made himself a bed, and pine needles are extremely insulating. And, he had a blanket, but, it was of natural materials. And, he survived in that way. And he was the ultralighter, right? Going that way. But I have never met anyone who's doing that. I have a few friends who they're experts in primitive skills, and they go out and build a shelter and so forth. But as far as hiking and camping goes, I have yet to meet someone doing that. And, it's interesting, but, the early explorers, I think in some ways were closer to that natural thing than we are now. But it depends. I mean, it depends. If you read about LeConte, right? He used to set up a huge base camp, and they used to party out there. He and his friends. So it kind of depends.
We can't start fires as much as they could either.
No, it's terrible. Actually, when you read about them, they wouldn't just start a fire. I mean, sometimes they would set an entire tree on fire. I mean, what they did, we could not do. But the difference is, there might be one or two of them, and there are 1,000 of us now, on say the JMT. So, when there's one person out in the wilderness and they know what they're doing, it's very different from if 1,000 people all camped the way some of those early people did with the big bonfires and stuff, that would be a disaster. But back then, very, very different, very different experience.
You have a beautiful picture of the Sierra behind you, but when the sun goes down, you can't see that. But you can see stars like you've never seen before, ever. And they are there's, certain nights, there's not a bare spot in the sky anywhere.
Yeah,
it's just filled.
We call camping staying in a 10,000 star hotel, because you're right. When particularly if there's no moon, when you step out at night, it is unbelievable. I mean, if you've been to the desert or something, but it's unbelievable how many more stars there are than in any city, any urban area. And you just look up at that, and it's incredible. I mean, it's really, really amazing. I want to circle back for a second to something you said about the book, about the cover art. I don't know if you know it or not, but the cover art for the book was done by a very talented woman named Faith Rum, who is a local Yosemite artist. And she started out as both an interpretive and a wilderness ranger. So she kind of, I think her first experience in the Sierra was out there, as a ranger, and, painting and drawing called to her. And I don't have her whole story, but she has an entire series of paintings on the John Muir Trail, where she's hiked the trail and she's done these gorgeous paintings of the different scenery, like Thousand Island Lake and, evolution and so forth, and some of the meadows. And I was very fortunate, I approached her and said, hey, would you be willing to do a cover? And, she did it as an oil painting that she then added the silhouettes of the characters to the front of it. So, I was very lucky to be introduced to her and her work. And the book is illustrated. There are daily maps and drawings in black and white. And those were done by Jeremy Ashcroft of the UK, who's a very well-known mountain illustrator. And again, I know him through the John Muir Trail groups online. He's been posting a bunch of pictures. He's coming out with with two books, one on the 14,000 foot peaks in America, and one on the JMT itself, where he's been drawing the topography, and he was willing to do the maps and some of the drawings for the books. I was very fortunate to have folks like this working with me on it. And I think, it's made it a much more attractive thing. I wanted it to have, when you're a kid, you read those 1800s adventure novels, like Journey to the Center of the Earth or whatever. And
Oh, yeah.
they have those drawings, like Treasure Island had that map. I'll never forget that map in Treasure Island and staring at it and thinking about all those. You start dreaming about the places that they draw on the map, Skull Island or whatever. And, I never lost that sense of wonder at looking at those things. And I wanted that feeling in this book, and I know not a lot of books are illustrated anymore, but I really wanted maps and drawings. So, somebody who'd never been on the trail could really look at it and see and understand what, a third, more than a third of the JMT is above 10,000 feet. It's quite arduous. Almost every day you're going up and down a few thousand feet. I talked about climbing that waterfall in Yosemite, but you're doing that every day on trail, almost every day on the JMT. You're really putting in a lot of climbs and a lot of miles. And I wanted people to be able to visualize that, and also to see some of the places, that are in the book. So, Jeremy drew those, and I think he did a fantastic job. So, it was amazing working with those guys and being able to integrate that into the book.
Those are beautiful ink drawings.
Yeah, I love it. And the cover Faith did is of the Muir Hut up at Muir Pass, which is iconic.
Yeah, that's quite a drawing.
It's one of those special. It's the only real building you encounter on trail. Well, there are a couple of log cabins and other things kind of off trail you can find if you know where to look. But it's the only real building on trail is that one Muir Hut, and the ranger cabins. But the Muir Hut is fantastic. They built it out of rocks, out of the local granite, up there at Muir Pass, and it's really iconic. And I was so happy to have that on the cover, because that is JMT. That's classic JMT.
Right. I had never realized, I've heard that referred to, but never realized that it had a metal roof on it.
No,
that's the other one.
That's the Whitney Hut.
Yeah.
I guess you're right. There are two big iconic buildings on the JMT. There's the Muir Hut in the middle, and there's I'd forgotten about that. There's Gustav Marsh's hut up on top of Whitney, and that's a whole different animal. That was constructed as a research shelter, and it's not as beautiful as the Muir Hut. It's not as artistic. It wasn't done by a famous architect, but that Whitney Hut, a lot of people have seen that, and it has a metal roof, and that's a big issue, right?
I know, yeah.
People have,
but the Muir Hut, it's very, very beautiful, all stone, yeah.
The Whitney Hut gets hit by lightning quite a bit, and there have been cases of people sheltering in there in storms who shouldn't. There are a lot of warnings up there not to go in there in a storm.
Yeah,
it's like you say, it's got a metal roof.
So I know that you're looking forward to starting the PCT when you retire. That'll be in a couple of years, apparently. Are you doing a lot of planning for that now?
None at all. I mean,
I don't think it requires as much planning as people think, because the Pocket PCT is just a great way to plan it. It actually has all your water sources on there, and of course then you have Gut Hook now far out, I think they call
Far
it.
Out, the app.
But yeah, it's
Let's talk about that app in a bit. That's an interesting point. Is the app, and let's talk about the app now, and then I'll come back to planning for the PCT. Yeah,
okay.
there are apps for the phone. The JMT has them. Gut Hooks, which is now Far Out. I'm not sure they picked the best name for that. It's a little funny, right?
It's
But
catchy, yeah.
yeah, but yeah, it's a well-known phrase. So you can get these apps for the phone that tell you where you are. You don't have to have a signal because you don't have a signal out there, and you can find the trail. And those apps have a place. If you've done winter hiking, and I have done a
Oh
little
yeah.
bit, and I think you said you'd interviewed Ned Tibbets, who's he teaches the PCTers how to navigate in the winter. He has that mountain education school, and he's fantastic. Ned's a
Yeah.
friend. In fact, he was one of the early reviewers on my book, and he loved the book. But Ned's a wonderful person. Ned, he teaches that stuff, but you can get these apps that in the snow will tell you where the trail is, and you can follow it.
Mhm.
But the downside of those apps is there are a lot of people who rely on them, and they rely too much on them. It's kind of funny. I've been with people who, they get lost 2 blocks from their home without their GPS. They're like, I don't know how to go home. And you see that in the wilderness. I met one woman, and she was in tears up by Silver Pass, and she had wandered off the trail, and her phone had died, and she didn't know where she was. And she was just like, I don't know how to get back to the JMT. I don't know where to go. And I helped her back, and she was so grateful. But it was shocking to me how she was still on a trail. It wasn't that difficult, and she had not brought any paper maps. And people start relying on that GPS, on that phone, and they don't think about what happens if my battery dies? What happens if I drop my phone? It's really dangerous to go out in the wilderness and not have a backup and not know where you are. So, yeah, those apps are helpful. They'll tell you where the next water site is, or is the next campsite buggy. They're useful that way, but you've got to take it with a grain of salt. The person who said the campsite's buggy, that may have been a month ago, and it may be just fine now. And that water source may have dried up. And if your app breaks, what are you going to do then, right? You need to know where you are and have that awareness. So I think there are people who rely too much on those apps, and I think it's a danger, but they are definitely useful. They have their place. And, I think it's one tool you can have in your toolbox. But for me, when I'm planning a trip, I get the maps out. I get the physical maps. I lay them out on the table. I think about where about am I going to be, but I find the actual trip often differs. So, I'll plan. It's funny, the JMT hike I did with Joey, we were at exactly where we planned to be at every night. It was amazing. But, and part of that was we had planned to meet my wife. So I couldn't miss, the horses and my
Yeah,
wife. But, that's unusual. Usually your plans
that's for
change. And so
sure.
you don't want to over plan these trips. That said, if you're planning a long distance hike, you need to plan your resupplies. Your food will only last so long. And so you've got to know, okay, how long is it going to take me to go from point A to point B? And where am I going to get my next resupply? Where's my water going to be? You
Yeah.
do have to plan that out. And I will do that. It's just a little early for me to start with the PCT in terms of logistics. But yes, that takes quite a while, and it's a very important part. I would tell no one to just show up at a trailhead and wing it on a long distance trail. You're going to get in trouble.
Yeah. I definitely planned my resupply spots, but if I got there early, no big tragedy, because there's a hiker box. You had some food left, you put it in there. If you know, you're there early and everything's fine. If
I
you're
love
there late,
box.
yeah. If you're there late, you know, so you went hungry for one meal.
Yeah,
Not a big deal either.
that's a funny theme in the book too, right? You remember Gil's meals, right? Where, you know,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Gil
Yeah.
makes a classic mistake where, you know, he doesn't listen to anybody. He's young. And, you know, he buys these terrible backcountry meals, and then he messes up, and in his resupplies, he puts all the same flavors. So, you know, for the first 5 days, I think it is, he's eating lasagna and then, you know, beef stroganoff for 5 or 6 days. And he's just stuck with all the same meals. And when he gets to MTR, they, you know, Muir Trail Ranch, they have that fantastic hiker box, right? Where, you know, everybody from the PCT to the JMT who comes through there can leave their extra food and take what they like. It's like a wilderness recycle center. And, you know, Gil dumps all his meals and takes much, much better meals. And that's based on my own story. When I did the JMT, I didn't think about food. Now, you know, on a short trip, I just went to Albertsons and bought myself some cheese noodles. And, you know, I'd eat cheese noodles for a night or two and I was fine. So I had packed all these cheese noodles in my backpack, you know, a couple of other things, a couple of ramen noodles and so forth. But the majority of my meals were cheese noodles. And I can't tell you how sick of cheese noodles I became on that trip. I mean, you know, when you see Gil suffering over food, that was me. You know, I was eating cheese noodles every single night. And when I got to MTR and I saw that hiker box, man, all those cheese noodles were in the hiker box, and I was taking anything I could, all these different foods. And I was so happy to have the variety. So yeah, food planning is huge. Spend time thinking about food. Try your food before you go on a long distance hike.
Yeah.
You know, on a weekend trip, if you don't like your food, it's okay. But if you're out there for 20, 30 days or more, and you don't like your food or your bars for lunch or your oatmeal, it's miserable. And I mean miserable. That was the only thing on the JMT that I well, that and my pack weight, that I really suffered. I also had too heavy a pack on the JMT. I went in with 55 pounds, and boy, I learned quick. You know, my partner Joey,
Yeah.
he was carrying 30, and I was so jealous. You
Oh
know.
yeah. Yeah. If you can get it down to 30 on a full pack,
Yep.
then you're
Yep.
much happier. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
So
huge. So that kind of planning I will do, but it's early still.
so what I had when I did my longest hike in the Wind River Range, I had a GPS unit. That's what we had back then. The phones didn't do what they do today, and I had the 1 to 48,000 map of the whole range. I can't remember whether that was on both sides or two maps or whatever. And then I had an overview map, because you can find all your trails on the 1 to 48,000, but you don't know what's around you.
Yeah, that's a very important point. You know, when I was I took my son on the JMT this past summer, and I hiked at Nobo for the first time. I'd done a lot of Sobo and sections, but I'd never gone northbound. And so we started actually where the PCTers doing Kennedy Meadows, and went northbound. And you know, it was like a trip for him before college. And we got to Ray Lakes, and I was chatting with the ranger at Ray Lakes, and he was talking about this, and he was asking one hiker, you know, so what's your plan? Where are you going? And he pulled out gut hooks, and he said, oh, I'm hiking the red line to the blue line. You know, it
Yeah.
was like, you know, describing a subway map or something. It was really funny, but the hiker had no clue where he was. He was just pointing at the map, you know. And I met a guy this trip when we were where were we? We were at the bridge at Woods Creek at the bridge. And I met a guy who was having a hard time, and this happens, you know, he needed to get off trail. He needed to get off trail in a bad way. And he was following the advice of these apps. And he's like, oh yeah, there's a hike, there's a trail out coming up. I think it was Sawmill Pass. And he's like, yeah, I'll take that. And then I'll hitch up to my car. And I said to him, you know, you don't want to take that pass because, you know, what these apps don't show is just how dangerous some of these exit routes are. You know, Sawmill Pass is not well maintained. You could end up having a route find out there. And where does it take you? It drops you in the desert. So, you know, if you don't have water, if you're struggling with route finding and then you end up in the desert where you're not going to get a hitch, you got to walk through the desert to a road, you can die out there. So I said to him, look, there's this other trail that's, you know, you go out to Road's End. It's very populated. There's lots of people. If you get in trouble, and, you know, that's why he needed to get out, you know, then you're with people and there are rangers and there's a lot of tourists there. You can easily hitch a lift. So, you know, I redirected him. But if he was just following the app, he was just looking to the closest exit, and there was no real advice about where that exit led or where to go. So you make an excellent point. An overview map, knowing what's outside of where you're hiking, especially how it connects to roads and exits, is really important. If you were to sprain a leg or get injured or, you know, bad blisters or just whatever you needed to get out, and you didn't know your exits and which exits are good, that's a disaster. And on the JMT, I'd say half the exits are good exits and half the exits are going to be harder than the trail. And if you don't know which is which, you could be in a lot of trouble. You could really get yourself in a worse situation by taking the wrong exit. And, you know, that's something I would say you want to research before you go in. You know, what are the good exits? And a great resource for the JMT is Elizabeth Wenk's book. She has a guidebook to the JMT. It's, in my opinion, the best guidebook out there. And I'm biased. I know Lizzie, she's a friend, but I don't think I'm biased in saying that because I have read every book, I think, or almost every book on the JMT. And she goes and hikes the trails herself. She writes and does the miles herself. She's incredible. She'll do 30-mile days out there. And, you know, and her kids too. And, you know, she's amazing. And her books are really detailed with stuff like trip planning and what are the best exits. So it's a very valuable resource. And there are similar things for the PCT. There are similar resources. Yogi's book comes to mind for the PCT. But for any of these long distance trails, the AT or the CDT, there's a lot of resources out there. And it's important to do some planning if you're going to go out that long. You're absolutely right.
You have to do some. Yeah. Some people do maybe even more than you need to, but you know, like you say, you can't plan all the details because you don't know when you're planning your PCT hike, what day the wind's going to blow 60 miles an hour and it's going to rain all day, or you don't know any of that stuff. You don't know. Maybe you come to a river crossing and you say, oh, I better wait till the morning to cross that.
Yeah.
You don't know that one.
Or look for another crossing, you know. Yeah. On the JMT, the PCT, people have died crossing rivers. It's no joke at all. River crossings are probably the #1 cause of death on long backpacking trips. It's not the bears and the snakes or, you know, the snow or something like that. It's water crossings, falling off of logs. Yeah. Logs are slippery. The rangers have told me on many occasions, the #1 reason for evacuating a person is they fall off a log and they break a leg or a hip or something. So, it's surprising, but those are the biggest obstacles. And in my book, I describe some of those river crossings, but
Yeah.
you've got to have that mindset of, hey, is this dangerous? And don't push it. A river can be surprisingly dangerous. And if you don't think it's a safe crossing, it's worth the half day or whatever it takes to go upstream and look for something safer and something better.
Right.
And yeah, no, they can be very, very serious issues. And
So this is one of the transformative processes you go out there, is because nature calls the shots, not you. Nature tells you what rhythm that you will be in
yeah,
as you do the trail.
it's absolutely true. No, I have a funny story about a river crossing. When I was doing the Solomon's Trail, you go out into Tibbets Valley, which is one of my favorite places, but I wouldn't encourage any beginners to head there. It's a very remote, very difficult place to get to. And you're crossing the Middle Fork of the Kings, and there used to be a bridge, but the bridge long ago washed away. And I don't know, have you ever seen the Middle Fork of the Kings? I mean, it's people rafting.
I don't know.
It's a massive, massive river, and you can only cross it when it's a low water year, maybe late August or September if you're lucky. It's a very challenging crossing. And I was doing this trail and I was aware of that crossing. And I've got to tell you, that was in my mind. It was a source of worry the entire first half of that hike. All I could think about was, how am I going to get across the Middle Fork? Am I going to have to turn around and give up this trip when I get there? Because that was possible. I just didn't know if I'd get across it. And it was a low water year. I started that hike intentionally in a low water year. I would never have done it in a high water year. And I got down to Simpson Meadow, and I got down, and that's a trip in itself. You're dropping, crazy. It's a very difficult place to get. It's way downhill. You get down there, and the river was big. It was very big, but I was pretty sure I could get across. It looked like I could handle it, or I could swim if I had to. There was, if I went downstream, there was white water, but Simpson Meadow is fairly flat. And I thought, okay, I can do this. So I pulled out the InReach, the satellite device, and I sent a text to my wife because I was solo. And I said to my wife, hey, I've gotten to this river. I think I can do it. I'm going to go across. But if in 15 minutes I don't text you that I'm okay, call search and rescue. And, you can imagine how my wife was feeling. But, I did that because, of course, if I got in trouble, no one, would be helping me out there. I didn't have a hiking buddy. I was very much, intentionally solo on that trip. I really wanted that wilderness experience. And I started across the river. And the first thing that happened was the stick I was using broke. The river was incredibly strong. I had no idea how strong it was. It was very wide. And, when I describe Gill's crossings in heavy water in the book, it's based on that crossing of, the Middle Fork of the Kings I had. And it was tough. And I made it across. And, I didn't fall. I thought I might, and I made it across the river, and my heart was thumping, and I'm like, oh my God, I made it. And I pulled out the InReach to call my wife, and I had no signal. And I tried, and I'm like, oh my God, the clock is ticking. She's going to be calling search and rest. And I went upstream a little to a clearing. The signal went through, she got the message, and, she put down her heart, and we were okay. And I was like, Yahoo, relieved. But there was 5 minutes there where it was like, if she doesn't get this message, I'm in trouble. So, there's the flip side of the electronics, right? But
right.
but,
Yeah. Yeah, you need
that
a
was
clearing a lot of times.
that was a
You
moment.
can't be under tree cover sometimes for those to work.
Yeah, no, and that's another thing. Those satellite devices, yes, they work, but no, they don't always get a signal. And I think they over rely on them, and you've got to know they have limitations. Ned will tell you, and he's absolutely right, that if you do get in trouble and you do set off a satellite device, first stay where you're at, because search and rescue locks into that location. And second, get something red, like this vest you're wearing, or a big red sleeping bag, or something, maybe orange. Get something big and colorful and spread it out in a clearing so the helicopters will spot you, right? They're not going to see a guy standing there, but a big red tent or something, they'll see that. So spread out something big and stay put. Don't move. And if you do figure out how to get out and get help, call search and rescue and let them know, right? He just posted a story about some guy who, they were looking for, and the guy was in town, at a bar, and the search and rescue were out in the mountains risking their lives looking for a guy who was in town. I mean, it was a mix-up. I think his friends had called search and rescue, but he was okay. So let them know if you get out. Don't.
Yeah, so those are fantastic tips, actually. So one more thing, maybe you've already addressed it, is you say you're planning to hike the PCT, but there's a little fear involved. So yeah, you never can tell what might happen, and that's kind of good because it always makes your trip into an adventure, and you got great stories to tell when you get back. But you would think that the PCT is like a highway through the forest, which it is sometimes. But I have been out on the PCT when a section of it was closed and I didn't know it. And it closed after I started. And so here I am on a sandy, steep hillside, and there's no trail left. It washed out. So I'm not going to go into detail about that story, but you never know.
Yeah, you've got to have the experience and the tools to either deal with those situations, or you've got to have the smarts to go, hey, I'm going to turn around and I'm going to look for an alternative route. And that's where that bigger map you're talking about helps. And that happens a lot on the PCT. When I did Oregon, part of it got closed for a fire at one point, and it happens, and you can't always get that message out on trail, and you should never risk your life. I mean, there's a point where if you know what you're doing, it's okay. I remember I got to, what is it, Devil's Peak or Devil's Slide up in Oregon, and the entire trail was covered in snow. And, this was 2017, which was a big snow year. And, it was almost all snow from there up to Crater Lake. And I had snow skills. I mean, I've climbed Shasta. I know snow navigation, and I had no crampons. I had micro spikes. These are things that attach to your boots for traction. And so I was okay going into that, and I knew how to find my way. But if I did not have those tools, if I did not have those skills, and I would say to anybody, if you get into a situation like that where you're not sure, turn back. Because, if you go off a cliff and you're on snow, that's it, and sometimes there are rocks and things at the bottom. And, if you don't have, say, an ice axe for self-arresting, you're going to be sliding at high speed into those rocks. You're not getting out of there. So, it's not an adventure. It suddenly becomes survival. And, that's not a situation you want to get into. So I think people are funny. Sometimes they don't want to give something up. But, when you get to a situation like that, if I can't do this, this isn't safe, you should turn around and look for an alternative. If I had gotten to that river, into Hippity Valley, and that river had been too big to cross, I would have found a different hike that season. I would have looked for a way around, I would have done something else. I would not have pushed out into that water. And I have, experience. I was able to judge that pretty well. And I think sometimes we don't have it. We think, yeah, okay, I can walk on snow on a cliff's edge. No, you can't, because one slip and that's it, right? So, I don't know what to say to people, but use your best judgment, and sometimes discretion is the better part of valor, right? Turn around and live to hike another day.
Yeah. You do the best you can with that. If you don't get stuck in someplace, where it's not any better to turn around than it is to go forward, then you just have to come up with the best plan you can. But I agree with that.
It's interesting you mentioned that. You've read the book and you know the story of Solomon's, one of the early explorers, and the snowstorm. And I talk about this in the book. Solomon's, he's in the 1800s and he's out there with his hiking partner. I think, was it Bonner at that time? Or Bryce. I think it was with Bryce at that time. And he was up in the mountains on the JMT, well, a little off trail, up around Seven Gables, and he got hit by a huge snowstorm. I mean, a huge snowstorm. And Solomon's panics. He just freaks out. He thinks, I'm going to be trapped in the mountains. I'll never get out. So what does this guy do? He shoots his animals, which those were supported treks in those days. So he's now cutting off his possible transportation and, something to carry his stuff. So he shoots his animals, and he and his partner take as much stuff as they can carry, and they hightail it out of there. And what they don't take are a lot of the equipment that they really need. He just thinks, okay, we'll get down lower and we'll be out of the snow. And that's not what happens. They find they can't make any progress. They end up trapped, and they huddle and make a little fire, and they barely get out of there alive. And very famously, John Muir hears of this later, and Muir says, Solomon's is not a mountain man, because a true mountain man would know to hole up in a storm, to take shelter and wait for the storm to pass. You don't, at Solomon's hiked out in the middle of the blizzard. You don't hike in a snowstorm. You stop, you take shelter. And then when the snow stops, that's when you figure out your best options and your way to go. You don't panic like that. So, keeping your
I 100% agree. Yeah, you got to, every step you take is your own responsibility.
Yes.
And yeah, you got to be as wise as you can.
And let me take a second to add something here, because I think there's an important point that we haven't made about these big trails like the JMT or the Appalachian Trail or the PCT, or wherever people are living and thinking about doing trails. And that is, please do not make those things your first backpack. There are very limited permits for some of these trails, and you really need to be experienced. We do not need to have search and rescue and rangers looking for novices out in the wilderness and people getting into bad situations. Please, if you are interested in doing something like the JMT, I think you should. But it's a wonderful experience. I hope lots of people will do it, but please start with something simple. Do some weekend backpacking trips, do stuff at lower elevation, do things that are not as impacted and as crowded, and get your feet. Learn what is and what is not safe. Learn, things like I'm talking about, river crossings, and, how your body deals with high altitude and what your pack weight should be. Do you have the right equipment, and what do you need? You and I were talking earlier how you had brought an axe on one of your early trips, and
that was 30 years ago. Yeah,
right. But this is the kind of thing you're thinking, oh, I may need to chop wood, and you don't realize that's not something you need on one of these trails. So you're carrying 2-3 pound axe, and it's extra pack weight. So these are the
And that's
things.
dangerous.
It is.
Packing stuff because that limits how far you can go if you do need to go and get out.
And you need to know,
so
you need to build that experience slowly. Take a few trips with friends before you jump into one of these big hikes. I know there's a lot of people chomping at the bit and they're like, oh, I want to do something big, but baby steps. You want to start with something smaller, learn the skills before you do it, right? If you're a runner, you're not going to start by running a marathon. You're going to do something a little smaller first and build up to it. And it's the same with backpacking. Don't start on the JMT, please.
Yeah, there's a lot of mistakes that you make that you wouldn't make again. So it's good to have experience.
Yes.
I actually took a whole month off between my first section of hiking the PCT last year and when I started again in Oregon, or to get to Oregon, because there was snow on the trail. And I had to deal with a little bit of it. The very last section of getting to Etna Pass. And it was too scary. And I didn't want to deal with that again. And other people were saying at the store there, Etna Outfitters, oh, you can make it. I've done this and that. And I was still scared of it. I waited till it was gone.
Well, it's not just scary. Snow is draining. I mean, I don't mind hiking in snow, and I've done my share of it, but
this was at a 45-degree angle, and it was slick.
If you've got crampons, you're okay. You can do that. Yeah. Right. Well, then you shouldn't. You absolutely shouldn't. But if you have those spikes for your boots, if you've got the right equipment. But when you get into snow, your pack weight increases significantly because you're carrying winter gear. You're carrying things, the crampons weigh a pound each. You're carrying an ice axe. You're going slower because the going is much tougher. Sometimes you post hole, you fall into these pockets in the snow, and just struggling out of that is terrible work, especially with the heavier pack. So your miles go down. And the fact that you're doing less mileage in the snow means you got more weight on your back, because every day is an extra pound and a half of food. So,
and even sinking into a post hole is dangerous.
Yes. And there are crevasses in some of these places and cornices that you can go through and you can die. Snow is, particularly the soft late season snow, when some of these things hide rivers under the snow, and people will break through and fall into an icy river. And
microspikes won't work on a certain type of slush.
Right. Microspikes are good.
They'll actually attract the snow, and you'll end up with a ball of snow on your foot. I know that
yes,
this big a ball of snow.
Yeah, that's happened to me. I've slid on microspikes before, and trail runners.
They're great on ice. Yeah.
You'll see PCTers and trail runners go into the snow, these sneakers. And trail runners are great if you're on trail, but when you start getting into winter conditions, you want something a little warmer on your feet. You get frostbite out there, so I mean, I'm not telling anyone what to do. I know there's going to be 8 PCTers writing into your show going, hey, trail runners in the snow are just fine. And that may be fine for some people, but you've got to think about all that. It's all part of the bigger equation. And snow is no joke. Snow is absolutely no joke. And if you're thinking about going in the snow, someone like Ned Tibbets would be an excellent resource. Maybe you can put
Ned Tibbets would put exactly know what you need to do.
Put his contact information up with the podcast, so that if
I'll do that.
Listening to this needs a good introduction to snow hiking and wants to take one of those safety classes, he's the best. He's wonderful, and he's such a nice guy.
Yeah, you're almost always going to face some snow in the Sierra. Not necessarily, but usually.
Well, you know, in the book, and I'm not going to give any spoilers, but it snows on Gill in August up at Forester Pass, and
Yeah,
you know, I'm not going to talk about that scene because that's later in the book,
right.
but it's based on a true story. My wife and I, when we got up on the Forester in August, got into a snowstorm that became a whiteout situation, and you know, middle of August, you know, actually late August, we were in snow. You know, it can happen up there in the summer, and so we were prepared, but you've got to be prepared for that. You know, the mountains make their own weather. You
Yeah,
know, it's not the same as being at sea level, and you know, you need to be prepared for everything up there. One of the most common questions people ask on these JMT sites is, do I really need rain gear? And I always laugh because, you know, for me, I'm like, yeah, pack the rain gear. If you've got the rain gear in your pack, it'll never
yeah,
rain. But if the rain gear is at home, it's going to rain every day. You know?
yeah, yeah. I almost even on a day hike, I'll carry a 3 ounce rain jacket or a plastic bag or something. Yeah.
Yeah, otherwise you get
Well,
hypothermia, you know.
Ethan, I want to say again, it's a great book. I'm going to urge everybody to read it. And where can they obtain the book?
Thank you. Appreciate that. The book is really available everywhere. You know, I think for most people, you can just jump up on Amazon, type the trail. You don't even have to type my name, and it comes right up. I think you're going to post the cover, so they'll know what it looks like. So you can just find it on Amazon. It's on Audible now. We had a great narrator, Jake Hunsbusher, narrate the book, and he does all the voices, all the different characters in a fantastic way. In some ways, I got drawn into the Audible version because, you know, I mean, it took me 5 years to write this book. It was really a work, and you know, learning how to write in novel form and all this. And I've read it, I don't know how many times, you know, through edits and everything
You
else.
have to, yeah.
But when I heard Jake's narration, I was drawn back into the story. It adds a dimension to the book. It's like, you know, a third dimension of sound and emotion that he brings with his skills as a narrator that are fantastic. So if, you know, if your listeners are more into Audible audiobooks, you can get it on Audible. I think it's on iTunes as well. So there's an Audible version. And of course, it's available at bookstores. You know, it may not be, you know, stocked as a hiking book. It may not be stocked in your local bookstore. But if you go in and you give them the ISBN number, and, you know, they can order it. It's distributed by Ingram, which is probably the largest book distributor in America. So, you know, they can order it and get it in for you. And I encourage you to support the local bookstores. I think that's, you know, that's wonderful. So you can get it there too. And basically anywhere you get books, you can get it. You know, but I guess the easiest place is on Amazon. And of course, it's on Kindle. So, you know, it's available as an ebook as well. So yeah, you can get it anywhere, you know, and if you want, I'll give you some links for the podcast.
Okay, great. So the trail, and Ethan, thank you very, very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be a guest on your show.